everyone. You are listening to and watching Chris Hattingh, researcher at the Free Market Foundation, trying out a different format this week with the recording. And just so you know, I'm using very, very fancy premium equipment. I'm just recording on my laptop, but hopefully the quality is of a sufficient standard that you can hear everything I'm talking about. If you like this sort of format, please let me know in the comments below and we can use it going forward. My colleague Martin van Staden, I'm sure you all know about him and have read his articles and his research on our website. If you haven't yet, I highly advise that you do so. But he's in Germany at the moment at a workshop, and so you won't see the usual fancy graphics that he puts in. He's the brains behind this operation, so I'm just trying out my hand at it this week, and let's see how this sort of thing works. For this week, I just thought I'd talk about two big things in the news: the national health insurance and expropriation without compensation. There are some new developments around this now, announced by the government. So I'd like to talk about the implications of those two things and go through what they will mean for us as South Africans. For those of you listening and watching from overseas, I hope you find this sort of thing informative. So let's dive straight into it. Just sort of an overview. I was inspired for this week to talk about these specific things. I watched a video last night. It was Ayn Rand's final public talk, which she gave in November 1981. And the title of that talk was "The Sanction of the Victims." Now, in this presentation, which she gave to a group of businessmen, she made the point that the businessmen in America at that time were funding initiatives, organizations, institutions, especially the universities, which advocated for ideologies and policies which hated those very same businessmen, which tried to pull down successful people, which advocated for status controls over their lives, all this sort of thing. And I think this sort of thing is happening in South Africa as well. So, before we dive into the details, I implore you as South Africans, no matter your role, your capacity, your job, please fight back against these policies as best as you can, in your own work, in your own capacity, in your own social circles, at church, wherever. Talk to people about these things, bring up that there are different implications of them, destructive implications, and make people aware of policies for which they advocate. You can also fight back by supporting the work that we do here at the FMF. Please consider donating to us and supporting the work that we do. Alright, let's dive straight into the first one. So that's expropriation without compensation. President Ramaphosa's advisory panel on land reform and agriculture, which was appointed to advise him on the politically charged land question, strongly affirmed property rights as a cornerstone of the Constitution, while recommending that expropriation of land without compensation can occur in tightly defined circumstances. Now, as happy as I am that they strongly affirm property rights as a cornerstone of the Constitution, they're still recommending expropriation without compensation. And I think once you dilute property rights, once property rights are not an absolute in the Constitution, you're going to see the consequences of that. You're going to see investment leaving the country. You're going to see, not that we have any sort of economic growth at the moment, but you're going to see even more of a contraction and diminishing diminishing size of the economy in general. And this sort of thing, it simply cannot stand. You cannot have, on the one hand, say you respect property rights, that they'll be protected, while also advocating for expropriation without compensation. You cannot have one with the other, unfortunately. Philosophically, metaphysically, property rights are either absolute. You are either protected from the government taking your property, or the government can take your property in certain situations, but we cannot have both. The majority of the panel agreed it is necessary to amend the Constitution to make explicit the grounds for expropriation without compensation, although some panelists say that the Constitution does not stand in the way of implementing land reform. On Sunday, Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, Toko Didiza, released the report to the public. The report serves as a recommendation to the government, and it is not binding, so whatever comes from the report, it does not mean that the government must necessarily adopt what the report says. And I'm sure for some people who have been advocating for expropriation without compensation for a long time, the report will not go far enough, and they'll push even harder for the state to be the custodian of all land, which I think will come down the line if it doesn't now. Once we start the process of diluting property rights in the Constitution, we're well on our way to the state owning all property in the country, and heading back to pre-1994 days. The panel report says it is necessary to make explicit in the Constitution that there are exceptional circumstances that warrant EWC, and that the detail and content be set out in an Expropriation Act. Such an amendment would also make clear that wholesale expropriation without compensation is not possible. Allowing wholesale expropriation, says the panel, would collapse the core underlying values of the Constitution. Now, it's interesting that it says that, because I think by granting that expropriation without compensation should happen even in limited circumstances, you're still undermining the core principles of the Constitution. And, once, as I mentioned earlier, once you undermine property rights in any way, the process becomes accelerated faster and faster, because the state is going to push more and more to control more and more property. So that politicians can decide for us what they want to do with property, not what we want to do with our own property, which we own, and legally so. The specific conditions the panel believe would allow for EWC include, but are not limited to, and that "but not limited to" part is very concerning for me, because it simply says, okay, we're going to give you a list of 5 examples for, just to, let's say 5 or 10. But even then, that might not be enough, and then the government can still go further and say, well, this is also justified, this avenue is justified, we can do this, we can do that. It's way too vague. It violates the core principle of the rule of law, that laws shouldn't be arbitrary, and it further dilutes the very idea of property rights. Just a few of those examples, where EWC could be allowed but are not limited to. There's abandoned land, hopelessly indebted land, land held purely for speculative purposes, land held by state entities and not utilized, land obtained through criminal activity, land already occupied and used by labor tenants and former labor tenants, informal settlement areas, inner city buildings with absentee landlords, land donations, and farm equity schemes. Just that first one, the second one, land held purely for speculative purposes. I'm not sure who gets to determine what speculative purposes are. This is again an example of us granting the government way too much power to decide something so arbitrary. And it could vary from minister to minister or president to president, who will say, in this case, speculative purposes includes that, or includes this, or includes Y or C or A or B. And that grants the state way too much power to decide this sort of thing. Just one last thing, the panel also recommends that the Ingonyama Trust be scrapped or reviewed. Now, that's a very hot political issue for President Ramaphosa to try and resolve. I'm sure that the Zulu King and the Zulu community in the Ingonyama Trust will kick back hard against that sort of thing. But just as an example, when the state becomes the custodian of all land, as expropriation without compensation will allow, it can decide who lives where. No group, no race group or gender group or religious group will be safe from this sort of power. If you're more on the left or the right of the political spectrum, always try and imagine your worst nightmare political opponent being in control of the levers of power in government, and then advocate for as limited a government as possible. You don't want your opponent to use the powers of the state against you, so therefore you should never advocate for a government or a state which has unlimited power over your life, because your opponents could get into power and then use that power against you and the people you value in your life. So we should always keep that sort of thing in mind. EWC will undermine food security in the country. It will drive away investment. No rational foreign or local investor will invest in a place where their property isn't safe from arbitrary seizure by the government, and they'll simply invest in other places. We're making it more and more difficult for people to invest in this country. We're giving them fewer and fewer reasons to invest in this country, and we're going to see the consequences of that. And as always in South Africa's history, the people who will suffer the most are poor black South Africans. Under colonialism, under apartheid, they were denied their property rights, and expropriation without compensation will once again deny them their rights, which they are entitled to as property owners. No one's property should be under threat of seizure by the government, no matter how good the justification, the reasons that government wants to use. Those sorts of things should never be allowed, and we're going back to pre-1994 South Africa with this move. When investment leaves the country and the economy contracts even further, poor black South Africans are going to suffer the most. For people who can afford to leave, they will leave. For others who can't, they're going to have to stay here and suffer the consequences of these statist and socialist policies. Now, the second one I wanted to talk about this week was the National Health Insurance, or NHI. government is pushing through a revised NHI bill. Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize says universal health coverage is essential and that the NHI will happen whether people like it or not. So really, really going ahead with this plan. The bill has been passed by Cabinet and will be tabled before Parliament. Most glaringly, the Minister could provide no clarity on how the NHI would be funded. Now again here, I don't think NHI funding should be the focus. The focus should be on the very moral premise that the state should give us healthcare and decide for us where we should go for our healthcare. So that, to me, is deeply immoral. It should be up to each person to take care of themselves and their families, and to interact with others, in a form of charity if they choose to do so, not for the government to tell us that we must have healthcare, that we must have it in this way or that way, that we must care for each other, that sort of thing. So the very moral basis of the NHI for me is corrupt because it places the state above the individual and the decisions and responsibility of the individual. If you thought, for example, that VAT hikes were being held in reserve to fund the NHI, think again. There is no fiscal room for the NHI, not for the NHI nor for anything else. Anyone who thinks otherwise doesn't understand the fiscal implications of Eskom. I'm sure you all know that there's another bailout for Eskom announced last week. So that's where most of the money of government is going, and it makes absolutely no sense that they're going ahead with NHI because there's no money for it. I know that these sorts of things don't necessarily bother those who advocate for more statist policies. They simply think that the money will come from somewhere, but it won't. And again, with expropriation without compensation, and the same with NHI, investment will leave the country, and there'll be even less and less money for these sorts of grand socialist, statist plans. It's as simple as that. I guess on a positive note, if you want to call it that, although it comes with a certain caveat, medical aid schemes will be allowed to exist when NHI is rolled out, after employees or employers have paid their premiums for the fund. And then just a quote from the minister, he said, and I quote, "Are you saying because of private self-interest must we compromise the lives of South Africans?" End quote. Now, of course, this implies that because you, for example, have private healthcare, you're compromising the life of someone else. That to me is a false assumption, and it's very problematic, because me investing in something, buying something, does not take it away from someone else. It is my decision with the person I trade with, where I want to use my money, and for him to trade his good or service for my money. It doesn't take it away from someone else. Now, when resources are limited, as they always become under these sorts of planned government initiatives, then it becomes a case of political favors. The government can decide who deserves healthcare, who doesn't, and then it very much will become a case of, if I get healthcare, you won't, because the resources will be that limited. It is my view that if government is going to be involved in any healthcare at all in the country, it should use its very limited resources to improve the level of healthcare for poor people who can't afford any level of healthcare. It is also my view that private medical schemes, it is in their interest, and they could make a good profit from this if they provided more healthcare services to poorer people, and maybe at some point they will, but with the NHI coming, that sort of thing will never come about, and the quality of healthcare overall is going to suffer, because more and more people are going to have to pay more and more into the NHI fund, and that's going to drive away good doctors, nurses, practitioners, specialists, etc., and then the quality overall is going to drop, and everyone is going to suffer accordingly. As with any socialist plan, when you drive away those with skills and you drive away the profit motive, everyone suffers accordingly. So in a way, it is good from their perspective, because it's going to equalize everyone. And as we all know, inequality is very, very bad. So if we all suffer equally, then surely that's a good thing. Excuse me. The minister also said that people with private healthcare could not see a specialist if they wished to, for no good reason. No good reason. Who knows what that means? That's one of these things that politicians love to throw around, because they, I suppose, they're enlightened, they're the philosopher kings, they can decide this sort of thing, what a good reason is. It is not up to any of us to decide what a good reason is for us to go to a specialist. He also complained that people visited specialists for treatment that GPs could give. Instead, specialists needed to treat the sickest South Africans. And then another quote, and I quote here, "It is not my right to see a specialist because I can't afford it. It is a distortion of how the system should be working, end quote. Now there, I mean, that's where you have it right there. The minister thinks it is not your right if you spend money on a particular doctor or specialist. It is not your right to decide what happens with your healthcare and with your money. Now that is a deeply moral problem. He's again placing the group way above the individual, and that's simply not how things ought to work. The individual should be free to decide for him or herself what she spends her money on, whom she trades with, which specialists she goes to, and this is inverting that proper moral order of things. This is making the state the final arbiter of whom you can go to for your healthcare, and it is deeply problematic to me. It undermines any notion of dignity, of individual responsibility, and it's going to result in an unworkable, in a very expensive, in a very time-consuming healthcare system where the state decides who goes where, who trades with whom, who goes to which doctors, where doctors can work and where they can't, where they should be spending most of their time and where they shouldn't be, how many hours they should be working, how much or how little profit they can make, all these sorts of things. So it's inverting, to me, the proper moral order of where things ought to be, with the individual in charge of their own lives. The minister also said that a key part of NHI was for social solidarity. Now, if social solidarity means holding a gun to someone's head and telling them that they must care for their neighbor, I want no part of social solidarity. I don't think for anything to be considered charity, that there can be a foundation of force underpinning it. Once you hold a gun to someone's head and tell them that they must care for their neighbor, you're removing any notion of morality, of goodwill, of charity from any conversation. Morality cannot result from force. So despite the nice word, despite the talk of social solidarity, which again is in sort of open-ended term, it's used to justify these sorts of things, but at the end of the day, it is government using force to tell people whom they can interact with and that they must care for each other. And to me, that is not charity in any substantial and good way. The minister also added that some people say NHI is unaffordable. What is unaffordable is the rising cost of private healthcare. So there you have it. I think we shouldn't just focus on the argument that NHI is unaffordable. We should also be making the moral argument, and to me the moral argument is that the individual should be in charge of his or her own healthcare, and that is right for them to be in charge of that. It is your responsibility to live your own life, not for any government bureaucrat or politician to make these sorts of decisions for you. If people want to pay into health schemes for poorer people, then they're completely free to do so. But forcing people to live in this way is, to me, deeply, deeply immoral. And we're going to see the bad consequences of this sort of thing. And to go back with my point on expropriation without compensation, poorer South Africans are going to suffer the most again, because richer South Africans, be they white or black, Indian, Chinese, whatever, they can go overseas for proper medical care, but poorer people will be forced to stay in South Africa and to use hospitals, doctors, nurses who have been ground down by a system of bureaucracy and inefficiency. And it's also going to breed a lot of, I think, social unrest, social discontentment, that sort of thing. When government tries to force people to live in certain ways, to act in certain ways, that breeds a lot of resentment, and you try and curry favor with a certain group or a certain politician to get ahead. Whereas in a free market, it's all about voluntary interaction, voluntary trade, and to me that's the proper way that things should be. So that brings us to the end of the podcast. I hope you found it informative. I'll remind you all again, please support the work that the FMF does. Please consider donating to us. We try and fight back against all these policies as best as we can, and we can only do that with your help. So in a proper capitalist voluntary way, I'm appealing to you to donate us if you find value in our work. We try and fight the good fight as best as we can. Please remember to share this podcast all over your social media platforms. Please talk to your friends, family, co-workers about these issues. Very often we hear that people, when we talk about the consequences of these policies, people simply aren't aware of them. So let's try and get the news out as best as we can. And to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, Ayn Rand's talk on the sanction of the victims, please go and watch that. We in South Africa must make explicitly clear that we're against these policies which try to increase the state's control over us, over our lives. People didn't fight against apartheid for the state to simply control them again in 20 years' time. We must fight this sort of thing now, lest we go down the same path as Venezuela, Zimbabwe, North Korea, etc. South Africa should be a country of free individuals, free groups, people voluntarily trading with each other, living their lives to their best ability, and giving charity to each other if they see fit. It is not up to any state, no matter who's in charge, to tell us how we ought to live, what we should spend our money on, where we can live, what we can invest in, which doctors we can or can't go to, any of these things. Please remember to find our work on www.freemarketfoundation.com. Also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Please follow myself, Martin van Staden, and Mpiaki Glamini on our respective Twitter and Facebook accounts. Please share our work. And again, please talk to the people around you about these issues. Let's create some serious pressure on government to stop down this socialist path that they're trying to take South Africa on, or path of non and anti-freedom and anti-economic growth. Thank you all once again for listening. I hope you found the podcast informative, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.